The morning she found out she was pregnant, Andie burned the toast twice and didn't notice either time. She was standing in the kitchen of the condo she and Fletcher had bought together 3 years ago, staring at the little plastic stick on the counter like it might change its mind. 2 lines, clear as anything. She picked it up, set it down, picked it up again. Outside, a February wind was pushing snow sideways across the Ottawa skyline, and the radiator in the corner was making that sound it always made. A low, insistent knocking, like someone trying to get in. She called Fletcher at 8:14 in the morning. He didn't pick up. She told herself he was in a meeting. He was always in meetings. He worked in commercial real estate development, which meant his life was a revolving door of site visits, investor calls, and late dinners that ran until 10. She had learned to hold her news until he was home and fed and settled. That's what you did when you were with someone like Fletcher. You learned his rhythms, and you worked around them. So she waited. Andie was a physiotherapist at a rehabilitation center in the Glebe. She'd built her client list from scratch after finishing her master's at Ottawa, mostly word of mouth, mostly the kind of patients who'd been told by 3 other practitioners that their prognosis was uncertain. She liked those cases. She liked the slow, stubborn work of it. Her colleague Petra, who'd known Andie since their first year of grad school and had witnessed every chapter of the Fletcher situation with increasingly less patience, said Andie had a gift for believing in people who'd stopped believing in themselves. Andie thought that was a generous way of putting it. She just hated giving up. Fletcher came home at 7:30 that night, smelling of bergamot and red wine, and the kind of easy confidence that meant the dinner had gone well. He dropped his coat over the back of the armchair without looking, and kissed her on the cheek on his way to the fridge. "You eat already?" "I waited," she said. He pulled out the leftover pasta she'd made the night before and started eating it cold, standing up, scrolling through his phone. She watched him from the doorway of the kitchen. "Fletcher, I need to tell you something." He looked up then, maybe something in her voice. He set the container on the counter. She showed him the test. The silence that followed wasn't the kind she'd hoped for. It wasn't the held-breath silence of someone trying to absorb joy. It was a different kind, the kind that has texture to it, a careful quality, like someone choosing their next words very precisely. "Okay," he said. She waited. "How far along?" "Maybe 6 weeks. I have an appointment Thursday." He nodded slowly, looked down at the test in her hand. Then he said, "We should talk about this," in the same tone he used when a deal was going sideways, calm, controlled, already managing the situation. That was the first thing that should have told her something. She told herself it was shock. She told herself he needed time. She went to her Thursday appointment alone because he had a site visit that couldn't move, and she lay on the paper-covered table and listened to the technician point out a small, flickering shape on the screen, and she felt so much love for that small shape that her chest actually ached with it. She took a photo of the ultrasound on her phone. She texted it to Fletcher. He replied 2 hours later. "Saw this. Can we talk tonight?" They talked. He said he wasn't sure he was ready. He said they hadn't planned this. He said he needed her to understand that his life was at a very critical point professionally, and that adding something this significant to the equation was, and here he paused, searching for the word, complicated. Andie said she understood. She didn't understand. She wanted to. She tried to. She went over that conversation in her head for weeks afterward, trying to find the version of it where his hesitation made sense, where she could trace a line from the man she'd loved for 4 years to the man sitting across from her at the kitchen table, saying the word complicated about their child. She couldn't find that version. What she found, instead, were the small things she hadn't let herself see. How his phone had started going face down on the table. How he'd started going to the gym at odd hours, early morning or late at night, which should have seemed reasonable except that Fletcher had never been a gym person. He'd always said he had no patience for it. How a particular name, Soren, kept appearing in his schedule in ways that were vague enough to be professional, but frequent enough to be something else. She didn't ask. She should have asked. She told herself she didn't ask because she trusted him, but the truth was closer to something she wasn't ready to say out loud yet, that some part of her already knew, and she was choosing, day by day, not to look directly at it. She was 29 years old, 14 weeks pregnant, and working 40 hours a week, and she needed things to be okay, so she let herself believe they were. Her mom, Carol, noticed before Andie admitted anything. Carol was the kind of woman who had raised 2 daughters largely on her own after Andie's dad left when Andie was 11, and she developed a particular radar for the things people didn't say. She lived 40 minutes outside the city, in the house in Almonte, where Andie and her sister Jenna had grown up, and she called every Sunday morning without fail. "How's Fletcher?" "Fine. Busy. Is he coming to the appointment with you?" Pause. "He's trying to move some things around." Another pause. "Carol's kind. The kind that knew exactly what it was hearing." "Andie, Mom, I'm fine." She wasn't fine. She was exhausted and nauseated, and increasingly certain that the man she lived with was somewhere far away from her, even when he was standing in the same room. But she had learned very early that falling apart was something you did on your own time, in private, and then you put yourself back together and kept going. That was the Caldwell way. Her mom had passed it down without meaning to. The night everything broke open, it was raining. One of those February rains that Ottawa gets sometimes between the proper snowstorms, wet and gray and miserable, the kind that finds every gap in your coat. Andie had left her umbrella at the clinic. She was on her way to the Rideau Center. There was a specific vitamin supplement her midwife had recommended, and the pharmacy near their condo had been out of stock for 2 weeks. It was a small errand, the kind she'd have asked Fletcher to pick up. Except Fletcher had stopped being easy to ask for things. She came out of the pharmacy and was cutting through the main atrium toward the parking structure when she saw him. Fletcher was standing near the entrance of the restaurant on the main level, the one with the long bar and the soft amber lighting. He was wearing the charcoal jacket she'd given him for his birthday last spring. He had one hand on the small of a woman's back, guiding her gently, the way you do when you're making sure someone you care about gets through a door safely. The woman was pregnant. Not slightly, visibly, unmistakably, perhaps 6 or 7 months along. She had one hand resting on her belly the way pregnant women do when they're not even thinking about it. Just instinctive and constant. She was laughing at something Fletcher had said, and he was watching her with an expression Andie hadn't seen on his face in a very long time. Andie stood completely still in the middle of the atrium. She had the pharmacy bag in her hand, the prenatal supplements. She was 16 weeks along and wearing the same coat she'd had since her second year of grad school because she'd been saving for a crib, and Fletcher was pressing his palm to another woman's back like she was something he was protecting. She didn't know how long she stood there. At some point he looked up. Their eyes met across 20 feet of mall atrium, and a silence so loud she felt it in her back teeth. He said her name. She could see his mouth forming the word Andie, but she couldn't hear it over the sound of whatever was happening inside her chest. He stepped forward, and she stepped back, and then she turned and walked toward the exit, because she genuinely could not be in that building for one more second. She sat in her car in the parking structure for 40 minutes. She didn't cry. That surprised her, later. She'd always assumed the moment you discovered something like that, you cried. But she just sat there with the pharmacy bag in her lap and the rain hammering the roof of the parkade, and she felt a strange, hollow calm, the kind that comes right before something big shifts. He texted, then called. She watched the screen light up and did not answer. She drove to her mom's house. Carol opened the door before Andie even knocked, which meant she'd seen the headlights, and when she saw Andie's face, she just stepped aside and let her in without asking any questions. There was a pot of something on the stove. There was a lamp on in the corner. Andie sat down at the kitchen table where she'd done homework and eaten cereal, and cried over the small disasters of childhood, and she finally said the thing out loud. "He's been seeing someone else. She's pregnant. I think it's been going on a long time." Carol sat down across from her. She didn't say "I knew it" or "I told you" or any of the things she could have said. She just reached across the table and put her hand over Andie's hand and kept it there. "You're staying here tonight," she said. It wasn't a question. The next few weeks were the logistical nightmare of unweaving 2 lives that had been wound together for 4 years. Andie went back to the condo only when she knew Fletcher wasn't there. She took what was hers, left what was his, and tried not to linger in rooms that still smelled like the life she'd thought she was building. Fletcher tried to explain. He called and he texted and he showed up at Carol's house once, which was a mistake, because Carol answered the door and said 4 words, "She doesn't want to," and closed it again. Andie talked to a lawyer. She talked to her midwife. She talked to Petra, who came over with Thai food and said very little, and just let Andie talk until her voice went hoarse, which is exactly what Andie needed. She did not talk to the woman. She had nothing to say to her. Whatever that woman had been told or believed was between her and Fletcher, and Andie had enough to carry without adding that to the weight. What she couldn't explain, not to Carol, not to Petra, not even to herself, not yet, was the grief that wasn't about Fletcher at all. She'd expected to grieve the relationship. She'd expected to grieve the version of the future she'd planned. What she hadn't expected was the specific, bone-deep ache of suddenly doing this alone. She'd imagined someone in the passenger seat for this. Someone at the 20-week scan, squinting at the screen. Someone to put their hand on her back, the way Fletcher had put his hand on that woman's back. She hadn't planned to do this alone. But she was doing it. Her clinic building was a converted Victorian on Bank Street, 2 floors, with a waiting room that always smelled faintly of the cedar oil diffuser her front desk manager insisted on. The other practitioners in the building included a massage therapist, an occupational therapist, and a chiropractor named Marcus. No, she needed new names for this story, and Marcus was on the list. A chiropractor named Wesley who was reliably cheerful and reliably unhelpful at everything except cracking backs. And then there was Owen. Owen Ashby had moved into the vacant suite on the 2nd floor in October, setting up a sports medicines practice that was, within 3 months, embarrassingly busy. He was tall and quiet and moved through the building like someone who'd learned a long time ago not to take up too much space, which Andie noticed because it was so different from Fletcher's way of moving through rooms. Fletcher, who assumed the room was waiting for him. Owen wasn't like that. He made coffee in the shared kitchen every morning and always made enough for 2. He'd started leaving a mug on the counter beside the machine without any commentary, and Andie had started picking it up, and this had gone on for 6 weeks without either of them formally acknowledging what it was. He knew she was pregnant. Obviously, she was 4 months along and not trying to hide it. He'd asked once carefully if she was well, and she'd said she was, and he'd nodded and left it at that. He didn't ask about the father. He didn't volunteer opinions. He just made coffee and held doors, and occasionally fixed things in the building that were broken. Not because it was his job, but because he noticed them. One Friday in March, she came downstairs at the end of the day to find her car had a flat. She stood in the alley behind the building, staring at it with the particular brand of tired that comes from being emotionally wrung out for 2 straight months. And she was doing the math on how long it would take a roadside service to arrive when she heard the back door open behind her. "You're looking at it like you think it'll fix itself," Owen said. "I'm giving it a chance." He looked at the tire. "I've got a spare in my truck, same size, I think." He shrugged. "If you want." She let him change the tire. She stood in the cold and watched him work, and thought about how strange it was that a person she barely knew was crouched in an alley in the dark, changing her tire without being asked, while the person who had promised to build a life with her was across the city in a restaurant with his hand on someone else's back. "You don't have to do this," she said. "I know," he said, and kept going. When he was done, she asked if he wanted to come in for coffee, and then immediately felt ridiculous because it was 6 p.m. and they both already knew there was no more coffee. He smiled, just a small one, the kind that reached his eyes, and said maybe another time. They had dinner 2 weeks later. She told him, in the way you tell someone when you're not really sure why you're telling them, about Fletcher, about the mall, about the pharmacy bag and the rain. He listened without interrupting. At the end she said, "I'm sorry, I don't know why I just told you all of that." And he said, "Because you've been carrying it, and you needed to put it down somewhere." She looked at him across the table. "You're very easy to talk to," she said. "You're very easy to listen to," he said. It wasn't romantic, or it wasn't only romantic. It was something quieter than that and maybe more useful. It was the feeling of being seen by someone who wasn't looking for anything. She went home that night and sat on the edge of her bed in her mom's house. She was still at Carol's, still hadn't found a new place, and felt something she hadn't felt in months. Less alone. She found an apartment in the Glebe in April. Ground floor, small garden out back within walking distance of the clinic. Carol helped her set it up on a Saturday, and when Andie stood in the center of the empty living room and said, "I think I can do this," Carol said, "I know you can," and that was the whole conversation they needed. Owen helped her move a bookshelf. He'd offered, she'd accepted, and he'd shown up on Sunday morning with coffee and hadn't made a thing of it. He stayed 2 hours. He fixed the curtain rod in the bedroom that was coming out of the wall. He sat on the floor of the half-furnished kitchen and ate the sandwich she made him. And they talked about nothing in particular. And when he left, she noticed the apartment felt less empty than she'd expected. She kept waiting for something to go wrong with him, for the other version of him to appear, the version that would eventually reveal itself as the one she needed to be afraid of. She'd done this with Fletcher for long enough that she had calibrated her optimism very precisely. She watched for signs, she looked for inconsistencies. What she found instead was that he was exactly the same at 8 in the morning as he was at 8 at night. That he called when he said he was going to call. That when he asked her how she was, he waited for an actual answer. She was 5 months pregnant when she told him she thought she might be falling for him, which she said very quickly while they were walking along the canal, not looking at him. He was quiet for a moment. I know, he said. She looked at him then. I mean, me too, he said. I didn't want to push. You're not, okay. But I need you to know what you're. I mean, there's a lot happening. I'm having a baby. A baby who isn't yours. And I don't know what I'm. Andie. She stopped. I know, he said again simply. I'm not afraid of it. She didn't know what to do with a man who wasn't afraid. It took her a while to learn how to simply believe him. The complication, because there had to be one, because that's how these things go, came from Owen's older brother Lachlan. Lachlan had decided, with the conviction of a person who had not been asked, that Owen was making a mistake. He appeared at Owen's apartment one Sunday, and then at a family dinner Andie had been cautiously invited to. And he sat across from her and was perfectly polite, in the way that people are perfectly polite when they want you to know they're tolerating you. Afterwards, she heard the edge of an argument she wasn't meant to hear. Lachlan's voice, low and certain. She's having another man's kid, Owen. I'm not saying anything against her. I'm saying think about what you're taking on. And Owen's voice quieter. You don't have to understand it. She didn't bring it up. He did the next day. My brother said something to you, he said. It wasn't a question. I heard you talking. I wasn't trying to. What he thinks doesn't change anything. I know, I don't want to cause problems in your family. Owen was quiet for a moment. Then, Lachlan has strong opinions about things that aren't his business. I love him, but I know what I want and I'm not in the habit of letting him decide that for me. She looked at him. Are you sure? I've been sure since the tire. She laughed, a real one, startled out of her. He smiled. The tire? She said. You stood in the cold and watched me and didn't pretend you weren't worried about how long it would take, and then you said thank you like you actually meant it. I don't know. Something clicked. She shook her head. That's a very boring origin story, she said. I like boring, he said. Boring means nothing's on fire. He was there when her water broke, on a Wednesday morning in July, 3 weeks early and completely without warning. She called him first, before her mom, which she hadn't planned to do but which felt entirely natural. He was at the clinic and he was there in 11 minutes. He sat beside her through 14 hours of labor. He held her hand when she asked and stepped back when she needed space, and at some point past midnight, when things got harder and she turned to look at him because she needed to look at someone, he was already watching her with a steadiness that she felt in her whole body. Her daughter was born at 2:47 in the morning. Carol arrived 40 minutes later, still in her coat, eyes bright, and she held the baby and cried in the way that grandmothers cry, with their whole faces. Jenna flew in from Vancouver 3 days later and spent 2 hours just sitting in the rocking chair, holding her niece, barely speaking. Andie named her Rosalind. Rosie, already by the second day. She had a particular scowl when woken up that Carol said was exactly like Andie at that age, and Andie believed her. Fletcher sent a message when he found out. Congratulations and a few words hoping she and the baby were well. Andie read it once and set her phone face down. There was nothing to say to Fletcher that she hadn't already said, or felt, or grieved and set aside. She had given that chapter exactly what it deserved. Her grief, her honesty, and then her absence. And she was done with it now. Owen met Rosie for the first time in the hospital room, still in the gray hoodie he'd been wearing when he rushed over, and he looked at her the way a careful person looks at something fragile and important, very still, very gentle, like he understood the weight of it. He held her for a long time without saying much. Later, in the corridor while Andie's mom sat with the baby, Andie said, You don't have to be scared of getting it wrong with her. She doesn't know enough to have expectations yet. Owen looked at her. I'm not scared. Okay, I just want to do it right. She reached over and took his hand, right there in the hospital hallway under the fluorescent lights, and she said, You already are. He squeezed her hand and didn't say anything, and that was enough. The months that followed were hard in the ways that having a newborn is always hard. The nights especially, the particular delirium of 3 a.m. and 4 a.m. and 5 a.m., when Andie would sit in the rocking chair in the small bedroom with Rosie against her chest, and the whole city quiet outside, and feel simultaneously exhausted and overwhelmed and more present than she'd ever been in her life. Owen came by after work on Tuesdays and Thursdays. He brought food, not always, and not in a way that felt like he was managing her, but the kind of thing where she'd open the door, and he'd be holding a bag from the Thai place 2 streets over and he'd say, I got extra of the noodles. And that was it. He didn't need to be thanked elaborately. He didn't need to be told he was doing a good thing. He just did it. Lachlan came around eventually. It happened gradually, and without announcement. He showed up with Owen one evening and was quieter than before, less pointed. And at some point during the visit, he held Rosie while she was fussing, and she settled almost immediately, and he looked up at Andie over the baby's head with an expression that was close to sheepish. "She's something," he said. "She really is," Andie said. Neither of them said anything more about it. They didn't need to. She and Owen got engaged on a Sunday in March, a year and 3 weeks after the flat tire. He didn't make it theatrical. He knew her well enough by then to know that theatrical wasn't what she needed. They were in the garden behind her apartment, Rosie asleep in the carrier on Owen's chest, and he looked at her in the afternoon light and said, "I want to keep doing this, all of this, with you and with her. I want to make it official, if you want that too." She looked at him standing in her garden with her daughter against his chest. "Yeah," she said. "I want that." He smiled, that same quiet smile she'd first noticed across a shared kitchen counter when she was still learning how to trust anything. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a ring, simple and clean, and exactly right, and she laughed a little, because of course he'd had it ready, because that's who he was. Someone who prepared quietly and then waited without pushing, until you were ready too. Rosie slept through the whole thing. At the wedding, Carol stood up during the speeches and said that the thing about Andie was that she'd never stopped showing up, even when showing up hurt. She said that watching her daughter become a mother, and then watching her find someone who understood what that meant, had been one of the great privileges of her life. She started crying halfway through, which made Jenna cry, which made Andie cry, and Owen sat beside her with his hand in hers and laughed quietly at all of them. Lachlan gave a speech too. He said he'd been wrong about some things, and that Rosie had corrected him, and that he was grateful. It was a good wedding, simple September, at a property outside the city with old maples, and a barn the owners had opened up for exactly this kind of thing. Rosie, 14 months old by then, spent most of the reception being passed between Carol and Jenna and Petra, and various others, occasionally looking around for Owen, and every time she spotted him she reached out her hands in the way babies do when they've already decided on someone. He always came. That's the thing Andie would think about later, in the ordinary days that followed. The regular mornings, the Tuesday dinners, the slow accumulation of a life that looked nothing like the one she'd planned and everything like what she'd actually needed. Owen always came.